Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Colorado's Captivating Mammals, presented by James Beissel. James is a passionate wildlife photographer and has been guiding for NatHab in North America since 2019. Thank you so much for being here today, Jim. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in today on your Friday. And I hope this makes your afternoon go a little faster and you enjoy some wildlife stories and photos here. So my topic today is Colorado's Captivating Mammals. And what I'd like to share with you is what happens when you take a rock climber's brain and point it at the problem of wildlife photography. I'd like to start with a quote by John Muir. And John Muir is quite famous as the father of our national parks. Here he is with Teddy Roosevelt in Yosemite, a place that's really near and dear to me. He helped protect this place. He co-founded the Sierra Club, and like my heritage, also came from Scotland. He said, keep close to nature's heart and break clear away once in a while and climb a mountain or spend a week in the woods. Wash your spirit clean. I think that's great advice. And Muir and I think if we'd had the chance to meet, we'd have a lot to talk about. He was famous for going out into the mountains with nothing more than a loaf of bread and maybe some tea. And it reminded me a lot of myself, especially when I was younger. One particular climbing trip I took in North Carolina, I was so eager to get out of town. We drove and drove and drove, and we're moving towards this place called Linville Gorge. And the towns kept getting smaller and smaller. And we passed our last grocery store and I realized I didn't bring anything to eat. Nothing. I didn't even have a granola bar. And luckily we passed this little country gas station. It was one of those places where you could buy ammunition and lottery tickets and fishing tackle and bait. And luckily I was able to get a little bit to eat. I came out of there with a 2-liter bottle of Mountain Dew and some animal crackers. And that was all I had to get me through that weekend climbing trip. Like Muir, I was just so eager to get out. I'd forgotten all about food. But to Muir, the need for wildness and nature and to get away was as vital to the soul and to the body as food was. And I promise you, if you go on a NatHab trip, wow, we're going to eat a lot better than Mountain Dew and animal crackers. So my story is from cragging to crittering. Now, cragging isn't a word you're going to find in the dictionary. It's just basically a casual form of rock climbing. You can spend a day without going too far from your backpack and enjoy some time with some friends while being outdoors. Crittering is another word you're probably not going to find in the dictionary. It's just looking for critters in their natural habitat. I grew up in Michigan, which is about as far from rock climbing as you can get. But luckily I had a great place called The Loft. It was an indoor climbing gym built very early before there were so many climbing gyms in the country. And at The Loft, I was able to learn. And with a little help from the 90s movie Cliffhanger with Sylvester Stallone, I sorted out how to rock climb and eventually saved up enough money while I was a teenager to buy my first rope and go to Grand Ledge, which is Michigan's only real climbing area in the Lower Peninsula, and start to learn the basics of rock climbing. Now in rock climbing, there's a couple of different disciplines or genres of climbing. Like when you think of rock climbing and you see people in the REI ad, a lot of the time what they're doing is face climbing. This is where you're pulling yourself up. You're using the little edges and ledges and holds that are on the face of the rock to move upwards. And this is like the type 1 fun. It's fun that's fun. But there's a type 2 kind of fun. When you don't have any edges, you can climb cracks. And to crack climb, what you're doing is you're jamming your fingers or your hands or your fists or your feet or your knees or whatever you can fit into the cracks and fissures of the rocks, and then twisting them, pulling them, torquing them, whatever you need to do to support your weight and pull yourself up. Now you notice in this picture, I've got my hands all taped up. I'm not like the REI model with their shirt off or the model with a sports bra on. You're getting pretty physical, sticking your arm into cracks, getting all scraped up. People sometimes get scraped up foreheads and ankles from this. It's type 2 fun, which means the kind of fun that's not always fun. Think about that. So of all the types of crack climbing, off-width climbing is probably my favorite, and it's a very eccentric niche of crack climbing where it's wide enough that you can put in parts of your body like your shoulder or your knee and use your whole body worm style to work your way up. It's very, very physical. It can be very, very tedious to move upwards, taking tons and tons of energy just to move a few feet up the wall. And what I think I'm attracted to about all of this is that it allows you to make your own path. You're not following a preset line of bolts like in sport climbing on the left where the anchors are already in place. You're carrying removable protection, which is a little greener too, you could argue, but you can climb anywhere you want. And I got to enjoy climbing all over the country, Yosemite Valley, places in the desert like Castle and Tower and the Fishers, the North Six Shooters, got into ice and alpine climbing, here I am on top of Half Dome with a good friend. And just what an amazing way to explore the world until knee injury that may or may not have been a St. Patrick's Day incident. I'm not going to say what happened there. Put me on the couch for a while, and I was looking at some downtime. So bought my first DSLR. And when everybody gets into DSLR or into photography as a climber, they want to be one guy, and that's Galen Rowell. He was the guy of adventure photography for so long during the film era, and was famous for running into the mountains with just nothing more than a light backpack and a lightweight camera and snapping these beautiful photos of the mountains. So that's what I wanted to do. I went back to the places that I had photographed or I'd climbed as a climber, and I wanted to capture them in photos. And I published my photos in guidebooks and magazines and things like that. That was Dorado Canyon outside of Boulder, Colorado. These are the Fisher Towers near Moab, Utah. And these are the cathedral spires, including the very famous Petit Grippin in Rocky Mountain National Park. All places that I love to climb, and I went back with my lens to look at them in kind of a different way. And one day a friend invited me to join him on Long's Peak. Long's Peak has a very famous climb that goes right up the middle of this. It's called the diamond, or the east face of Long's Peak. It's called the casual route, but there's really nothing casual about getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and hiking 2 hours to begin a rock climb at 13,000 feet and trying to beat the afternoon thunderstorms to the summit of the highest lightning rod on the Front Range and getting down before said thunderstorms roll in. Nothing casual about it, but my friend Sean, he decided he wanted to get some good photos of himself while he was climbing it. So I said, sure, yeah, I'd love to go up there and join you. I brought my longest lens and I hiked up here to the talus, and I set up thinking that I'd be able to train my lens on Long's Peak and get some photos of him while he's climbing. Here's what I got with my longest lens, not the guidebook worthy photos that I was hoping for. If you can't spot him, there he is right there, this little white blob. And I realized, oops, I'd made a mistake. This wasn't going to work out, but it was too late to really change my mind. By the time I would need to hike to another vantage point would take me too long to get into position. So I was pretty much just resigned to hanging out on the talus for the day, which isn't a bad place to hang out. Chasm Lake is a very beautiful place. And I had a little snack and I took a little nap, and then this creature pops out. I said, well, what is that? It disappeared. And it popped back out again a little bit closer. And then it disappeared again, and then it popped back out again, a little closer, and I snapped a photo of it again. And I knew, kind of in the back of my mind, okay, I think that's a martin. I think we had those in Michigan. I'd never really seen them. They're kind of these mythical creatures. But I'm pretty sure that's what it was. I had to go back home and look it up. And I really started to spark my interest. I was doing all these hikes, watching everybody else climb. But now I had this other adventure I wanted to take on that was more personal to me. And I realized I wanted to be a wildlife photographer. So if you know a climber, you know that climbers are obsessed with lists. They're kind of an OCD crowd. And if you ever hang out around a climber, you might hear about the Colorado 14ers, the 54 peaks over 14,000 feet, the 50 classic climbs of North America, the 7 summits, which is the highest mountain on each continent. Climbers love these lists, and they make these lists and they try to take off every climb on these lists. I had this list from Neptune Mountaineering, where I was working at the time, of all the classic climbs in the Boulder area, and we got incentives for completing them. So my climber brain, when I started thinking about becoming a wildlife photographer, said I need to make a list. So I pulled out this book, Mammals of Colorado, and I wrote down every mammal in the state of Colorado. And why mammals? Well, like I said before, I like to make my own path. I like to take the path less traveled. A lot of people are out there making lists of birds and photographing birds, but I want to do something a little bit different. I felt like maybe there were some unexplored stories to be found here in these mammals of Colorado. And I got some advice via a National Geographic photographer who recommended, well, if you want to be a photographer, don't go to Africa right away. Don't go to Europe right away necessarily. Like, you're competing with me if you do that. Find a story in your own backyard that you can return to time and time again and beat it to death, basically. You know, just dig and dig and dig until you find a unique angle, a unique perspective, a unique story. And then, you know, you can make your mark. So there's a lot of sense in that. So I began on my list. And at the beginning, things were pretty easy. I was able to go out just about every week and find a new species. I could find a chipmunk that I hadn't seen before, or photograph squirrel species. And, you know, I started finding some of the more elusive things, the beaver, the porcupine. Bobcat was one of my first big challenges. Had a little stroke of luck where I was able to photograph a mountain lion in the daytime near Denver, Colorado. And things went pretty quickly at first, but then I started to hit my first real obstacle. And that was the nocturnal mammals. I really had no idea how I was going to photograph these guys because, well, if you try to chase an animal around at night with a flash, it generally doesn't work too well. You get a picture of the animal's butt as it runs away from you, and it's poorly lit, and it's really difficult to focus. And around that time, I'd met another National Geographic photographer, Joe Reese, who does amazing work on the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the migration of pronghorn and elk through that area. And he was doing a lot of camera trap work, and I watched this beautiful presentation of all of his photos and got to pick his brain a little bit. And he recommended, well, you know, I think you should consider using some camera traps. And at that time I was, well, no, I want to photograph everything through the lens. I want to be a purist about this. And I quickly realized the error in my ways and how bad I put my foot in my mouth that day. So if I ever see Joe again, I can't wait to tell him the rest of the story. But I did start to use camera traps more and more. So these are just a motion activated camera, and I can leave it out to not disturb the animals. And when they come through and break the beam, it'll take a photo of them, and I can have the lights set up ahead of time. And that allows me to capture photos of these nocturnal species that you might never see otherwise. And this is a spotted skunk here. We have 3, possibly 4 different species of skunks in Colorado. The one that you see like in Bambi, your striped skunk, is a larger skunk. The spotted skunk, it has a black and white coat pattern that kind of looks like a thumbprint. And they're a little more animated in their behavior. Ringtail is another species that you will almost never see during the daytime, but we have them here on the Front Range of Colorado and in the desert areas of Colorado, especially in like the Pinyon Juniper Canyon lands. And these are relatives of the raccoon, very, very curious, you know, very bold. They might come up to you in a camp if you're camping in the desert at night. There's lots of people that have camped in the bottom of the Grand Canyon that have seen these. And one of the projects that I've been working on is to try to track their range as it expands on the Front Range. They seem to be moving north. Right now they're in Boulder, Colorado, and it seems like they may even be moving north into like Larimer County, Colorado soon. And possums, not very common in Colorado. They were very common where I grew up in Michigan, but only found like in the northeastern corner of the state here. So that one required quite a bit of driving for me to locate here. And eventually, I even learned how to use camera traps to photograph bats. And that's a very tricky problem because they're flying and it's dark. So the trick to that is to have a high-speed beam break sensor that's wired directly to your flashes, and you leave your shutter open for long periods of time, and you get lots of black frames. But then when the beam is broken, the flashes illuminate your subject and expose the photo, getting you a high-speed, really crisp photo. So of Colorado's roughly 130 species of mammals, about 70 of them made my list. Now, about 30 of those, or sorry, about 50 of those species are very small mice, voles, shrews, things that really don't want to ever be seen. And it's very dangerous for them to ever break cover because basically everything wants to eat them. So that left me with about 70 species. And of those 70 species, there are about 10 species that I call the X-Files. And these are species that haven't been seen in Colorado for maybe 100 years or more, or have never been documented here. But based on the best scientific knowledge, were known to be nearby, expected to be in the state, or were here once before, and there was some debate as to whether they're still here now. The grizzly bear is a good example. Grizzly bears have been extirpated, extinct in Colorado for, well, at least since the 80s. And before the 80s, it was many decades prior since population of grizzly bears was documented here. But there is some hope that maybe they held on in the remote corners of the San Juan Mountains. So they made the X-Files list along with things like gray wolf, the Wolverine, and a few oddball things like the Fisher, which is the Wolverine's smaller cousin that lives in trees, and only one had ever been documented in the state, and it was thought to have been released by a wildlife photographer in the 70s. So I began looking for some of these X-File species, and the first place that I looked was in the desert outside of Fruta. And I came to search for the kit fox. And with a huge stroke of luck, my first night of searching, in the middle of a giant thunderstorm, I found what was a kit fox, a couple 100 yards off the road. I was really excited. I was like, wow, this is a slam dunk. I'm burning through this list. I'm going to find all these X-File species. So next I went to remote southeast Colorado, Bobcat County, which is the Dust Bowl. And in the grasslands of Bobcat County, Colorado, there's these magical little canyons that are full of petroglyphs and all kinds of wildlife. And with a fair bit of effort, I was able to photograph this, which is another one of Colorado's skunk species, the hognose skunk. And then I went to the Roan Plateau area of Colorado in the western part of the state and searched for flying squirrels, which had never been photographed in Colorado before either. And I was able to capture some video footage of flying squirrels in Colorado as well. This is a flying squirrel photo from Michigan, since I'm still working on getting the definitive shot of a flying squirrel. In Colorado, we have a number of really diverse ecosystems, about 9 different ecosystems. And when you think of Colorado, you think of mountains, but a huge chunk of this state, 30 to 40%, is actually grassland. And it's home to things like the pronghorn, the fastest mammal in North America, which can go from a dead stop to 50 miles an hour in the blink of an eye. And of course, the keystone species that makes the grasslands work is the prairie dog. But the one thing that loves to eat prairie dogs is the black-footed ferret. But unfortunately, this animal is almost completely wiped out because of sylvatic plague and canine distemper, which were introduced diseases from the old world that this animal had no immunity to, until there are only about 18 left in the entire world, and the species went completely extinct in the wild. And when I started my project, there were no black-footed ferrets in the wild of Colorado. So I went to Arizona, and off of Route 66 is an area called the Aubrey Valley, and it's home to one of the more successful black-footed ferret reintroductions in North America. These animals are bred in captivity in facilities in Colorado, Arizona, at the Smithsonian, and then when they've proven that they can survive out there, basically, they run through a series of tests to determine their fitness. They're released into the wild, and this population has been expanding, at least until a few years ago, and things are a little more complicated there now. But to find these animals, you go out at night. They're very nocturnal. Use a searchlight to look for their eye shine. And then when you can locate them in their burrows, you can trap them. We're working under the guidance of the Fish and Wildlife Service there. I should definitely point that out. This is an endangered species, so it's not something that you can do without working with a permitted guide or a permitted scientific researcher. But I've been fortunate to volunteer with this program. And then they're brought back for a health assessment by a veterinarian. and their teeth can be used to determine their age. They get some shots, and then they get released back to where we found them again. And I got this amazing experience to see these black-footed ferrets in the wild, which I never thought I was going to top until a few years ago at Soapstone Prairie outside of Fort Collins, Colorado. We had one of the first releases of black-footed ferrets back into Colorado again, starting in 2013, and then in 2014, black-footed ferrets were released near Pueblo and Soapstone Prairie, bringing this animal back to its native habitat and home here in Colorado. So fantastic success story, almost the brink of disaster for the black-footed ferret. Of course, Colorado is famous for its mountains, and in the mountains we have that alpine tundra habitat, and the marmot is one of the most iconic species of that habitat. If you've ever hiked on the talus, hiked above tree line somewhere like Rocky Mountain National Park, you may have heard the chirp of the marmot as it watches you go by. It's probably wondering what you've got in your backpack. But marmots are hibernators. They put on fat during the summer, and then about right now, actually, they're going underneath the talus and they're going to curl up and shut themselves down to near zero until spring. The pika shares the same habitat as the marmot, but it does not hibernate. It actually works all summer long and creates enough food stores by haying or gathering grass and caching it underneath the talus to make it through the winter without hibernating. Pikas live in this very, very delicate balance between too hot and too cold. They have this very compact spherical body shape. It keeps them warm in the winter, but it's not very good for shedding heat in the summer. So if it gets too warm, the pikas will perish. If it gets too cold and they don't have enough hay or there isn't enough snow to insulate them, they can also perish. So they're really at risk right now from climate change and the effects of the changing and fluctuating temperatures, because they need that Goldilocks zone of just the right temperature in the summer as well as in the winter. And if that temperature changes too much, because they're on the mountains, they can't cross the hot valleys to get to new habitat. And it leaves them stranded basically on these sky islands. They're fiercely territorial. They are always vocalizing to one another, barking at one another, telling each other, hey, you, get out of my territory, get out of my hay pile. And you'll watch them on the talus as they kind of duke it out over territory. Tremendously entertaining. This is one checking out some scent markings here. So they live in these colonies on the talus, and this orange lichen is a great indication of pika presence. So their urine actually contains nitrogen and other things that cause this xanthoria lichen to thrive. So here in Colorado, we have a great citizen science project for pikas too, called the Front Range Pika Project. So if you're on the Front Range and that's something that you'd like to get involved in, I definitely recommend you look it up. It's something that you can do with the whole family if you like to hike in the mountains and help collect data on pikas. Now below the alpine tundra ecosystem, below that zone, a little lower right at tree line, we have this boreal forest where you find pine squirrels, snowshoe hares, and the chief predator of the snowshoe hare is the Canada lynx. And Canada lynx will eat almost 100% of their diet of snowshoe hares. They'll need about 4 a week to stay in good condition, which is up to 200 snowshoe hares a year. And this species was actually extirpated from Colorado by the 1990s and then reintroduced in the San Juan Mountains starting in 1999. So it's a threatened species at the federal level, endangered in Colorado. But the lynx reintroduction has been very successful. And in 2010, this species was declared successfully reintroduced, and we probably have about 250 of these in Colorado's backcountry today. Now, a lot of people are unsure if they've seen a lynx or a bobcat, so I'm going to give you a quick little primer on if you can get a photo or you can get a good look at their tails. On the left, you'll see we have a bobcat tail, and it's white underneath. The lynx tail on the right looks like it's been dipped in paint. It's black all the way around. So if you ever have an encounter and you're not sure if it's a lynx or a bobcat, there's a quick rule of thumb, and if you can get a photo of that tail, that's going to help you out. I was very fortunate to photograph a lynx in Colorado It's one of the most memorable outside experiences of my life. Sometimes serendipity just comes together, and it was one of those days where I was just able to be at the right place at the right time and just get an unbelievable close encounter with a lynx as it slowly, carefully walked past me on a snowy mountain road, and then turned around and gestured to its two subadult kittens to cross as well, right in front of my lens, looking right at me, knowing I was there. But as I just sat quietly, was comfortable, passed through silently, disappeared into the brush. Breathtaking moment for me in my wildlife photography career. In my search for the X-Files, I've managed to track down 3 of the 10 species. There's a couple more that may or may not be in Colorado. We know that there have been some wolves in Colorado recently, but one species in particular has really drawn me, and I really associate with this animal because I love to spend so much time in the mountains, and that's the Wolverine. And they are perfectly adapted for life in Colorado and are native to Colorado, but have been extirpated here for about the last 100 years. We only know of one Wolverine that's passed through this state in that time, and he came from Wyoming, from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and made his way through the middle of Wyoming. I don't know how. I traveled that road many times. It's a vast desert of oil fields. It's dry, it's barren, and somehow this alpine animal made his way all the way through into the mountains of Colorado, where he stayed for several years. And then eventually he made his way into North Dakota for some reason. No one knows why. And unfortunately, he was shot on a ranch there. But at least the rancher took the animal into their division of wildlife. An autopsy was done. It was identified as the Wolverine M56. This is a little bit of digital art that I did for a project working on Wolverine conservation in the North Cascades of Washington. And it shows really the key components of Wolverine habitat. They need snow that lasts into early summer for their dens. And Colorado has an abundance of that because of our 14,000-foot mountains. The biggest threat to wolverines is habitat fragmentation as well as climate change. For a wolverine to make its way from Wyoming to Colorado, it had to cross many highways, many interstates, and a lot of hazardous human development that wolverines are very adverse to. They really just want to be in the mountains and be left alone. And we've got a lot of wilderness in Colorado. So if we can continue to preserve that wilderness, and if we ever get the opportunity to do a wolverine reintroduction in Colorado, odds are that they'll do pretty well here. John Muir, again, I'd just like to close with another quote. Colorado is one of the fastest growing states in the nation, and I feel that our wild places make this a great place to live. And for me, finding this opportunity to create my own quest in wildlife photography based on the mammals of Colorado has been an incredible adventure for me, and it's been, invigorating and just giving me so much inspiration. So I firmly believe that preserving these wild places is in our best interest as well as in the best interest of the animals that live there. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed these stories. And at this point, I'll open up to any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Jim. That was so fun. We do have some questions for you, and I'd like to remind folks watching that if you have a question for James, you can submit that in the control panel in your questions field. Okay, first question is, when you get a great shot, how much is due to prior planning and how much is due to just pure luck?
I love it. It's a great question. My coach used to say, winners make their own luck. And another good quote, I can't remember who this one comes from, but the thing about luck is the more you try, the more luck you have. So I put in a lot of planning. I try to find the right habitat. I try to be there at the right time of day, at the right time of year, know the behavior of the animal, but sometimes it just comes down to putting in the hours, and eventually you put enough hours to get lucky.
And are you noticing, you mentioned earlier a little bit about climate change, are you noticing the effects of climate change, whether it's heat, drought, or fires on the mammals that you're photographing?
Well, this year, this has been an incredible fire season, and that alone has been very unsettling. We just had a temperature swing of 60 degrees here in Boulder on Monday night. The temperature went from over 90, we're close to 100 degrees to about 32 degrees in just a matter of hours. Just an unbelievable temperature swing. And I'm not a meteorologist, and I'm not studying these things, but the folks at NOAA that are say that climate change has a lot to do with that. Personally, the effects of the pika are hard to ignore. When we're up on the talus and it's 80 degrees, that's really hard on the pikas, and very unsettling to experience that kind of temperatures in those places as well.
Mm. So what mammal was the hardest for you to photograph?
Ooh, good question. Some of the ones that really took me a lot of effort, porcupine, and porcupine's one that I didn't think would be that hard, but they've disappeared on the Front Range of Colorado for some reason. Haven't gotten a concrete answer as to why. There's some speculation as to disease, but I had to search quite a bit for porcupine. Bobcat was another tough one. Badger was another tough one, but I'd say the one that I put in just an extraordinary amount of time for is the short-tailed weasel. We have two weasel species in Colorado. We have a long-tail and a short-tailed weasel. That short-tailed weasel, for whatever reason, I've spent over 100 days in the field in their habitat specifically looking for them, and I got one moment to photograph one in Rocky Mountain National Park. And unfortunately, we just stopped for lunch, and we'd gotten lunch to go, so we had bagged lunch sitting in the back seat, and it was on top of my camera gear. So we'd gotten nachos and burritos or something like that, and we're driving Trail Ridge Road, and sure enough, this beautiful white ermine, when they're in their white coats, they're called an ermine. In the summer, they turn to a brown coat. So it's this beautiful white coat ermine sitting on a rock, perfectly posed against the brown talus, just beautiful photo opportunity. And my camera's buried underneath nachos and burrito, and there's just this explosion of like guacamole and salsa, cheese, and everything in the backseat of my truck. My wife and I are just like fumbling the camera gear, and I rattled off a couple of shots as it slipped away, but that one is still stymied me. I really want to get like the definitive shot, and 100+ days still working for that one.
It's a great story. Can you tell us a little bit more about the camera traps that you use?
Sure. So I use DSLR cameras, like a Nikon DSLR camera, inside of a waterproof housing, and typically I've built my own waterproof housings in the past, although there are commercial available options now. And these are wired to either a motion sensor trigger, which is something like what you would have on your security light, or like a beam brake sensor, which is kind of like your garage door, where if you try to leave your garage too quickly and you break that beam, it stops the garage door and you have to go back and push the button again. So those will just trigger the camera when the animal comes through, and I'll often combine those with lighting so that can all be set up ahead of time, and the animal's in focus ahead of time. You know where it's going to be when it breaks that beam. And then it's just a matter of keeping the batteries going and keeping the bears from knocking it over, slobbering all over the lens to the point where the photos are all blurry.
Okay, going back to black-footed ferrets, what current threats are they still facing in Colorado?
Plague is never going to go away. Once it was introduced to North America, it's here to stay, and that remains the biggest threat to the black-footed ferret. There are some efforts to work on some vaccines, both vaccinating ferrets and vaccinating the prairie dog colonies. So one thing to really know about plague is that mammals don't carry plague, they die from plague. Plague is carried by fleas. So the fleas, once they bite the mammals and infect them, the mammals will die very quickly. They're not transmitting it from one another. It's these fleas that are really spreading it, which is really sad. There's some misconceptions as to exterminating mammals to try to reduce plague. Well, the fleas are actually the reservoir there. That remains a huge threat, and it continues to this day. Even here in Boulder County, we've had to battle plague quite continuously. Canine distemper, another disease that's still an ongoing threat, especially that the researchers that are working in these areas that are having to be very, very careful not to bring distemper in. That was one of the early pitfalls for the black-footed ferret recovery program, was canine distemper being brought into a breeding facility, which is catastrophic. And then just habitat loss as we convert more and more of our prairie into housing and subdivisions and malls. The the prairie dog colonies have declined enormously since their historic levels before development in the West. So that loss of habitat has also been really hard for the black-footed ferret. They need a lot of acres of good prairie dog colony to feed them because of their appetites.
Mm-hmm. And someone just asked on that note, if another animal eats one of these animals that have died of plague, will they catch it as well?
I do think that's possible. I think any exchange of body fluids, blood, anything like that could transmit it. That's
Okay.
not something I'm an expert on, but that's typically how they're infected, is being bitten by a flea and then it gets into their bloodstream. So.
Okay. And do you anticipate grizzlies making a return to Colorado?
Good question. I think it could happen. I think it'll be interesting to see where things go with some of the reintroductions that are on the horizon in Colorado. So we reintroduced 4 carnivores very successfully here in the last few decades: the river otter, the black-footed ferret, the Canada lynx, and maybe it's 3. And the next one up will hopefully be the Wolverine. But wolf reintroduction is on the ballot this fall. And there's been some talk of grizzly reintroduction. Now it's just going to come down to, can we find places where they can have the big chunks of habitat that they need? And there are places like that in Colorado.
Mm-hmm. And what about plans to reintroduce wolverines to Colorado?
Well, that's a species that I love to talk about, and they are native to Colorado. Colorado has great habitat. They've historically occupied just about every area of the state that has high mountains. And in the future, those places could remain good habitat even in the face of a changing climate, because they're so high elevation. The snowpack is going to last into June there longer than almost anywhere else in the lower 48, even though there's more wolverines in places like Glacier National Park. Those glaciers are melting very fast, and it's lower elevation in glaciers, 6,000 to 7,000 feet, compared to Colorado, where we've got those 14,000 foot snowfields. So right now, the Wolverine is going back and forth at a federal level to determine whether it's going to be listed as endangered or threatened or not listed at all. And that has been back and forth in the courts for over a decade now. A decision was actually due from the Fish and Wildlife Service at the end of August this year. That didn't happen. And I'm not expecting anything to really happen in the near future, but once this Fish and Wildlife Service decides whether to list the Wolverine or not, I think that Colorado may have an opportunity to make a game plan to pursue one path or the other. It's just kind of in a holding pattern until at a federal level a decision is made.
And someone who's also from Michigan asked about if you think whether or not the Wolverine could be reintroduced in northern Michigan.
Well, Wolverines are historically very, very rare in Michigan. There's been one Wolverine in the last couple hundred years, and that was in the Lower Peninsula, and a lot of debate as to how he got there. The Upper Peninsula, Michigan, very, very interesting idea. That's a place that I've spent a lot of time growing up. My family had property up there, and there are a lot of there's a lot of great wildlife there. There's wolves there, there's martens there, there's fishers there. So one of the great things for wolverines in that area would be scavengeable meals. Wolverines are primarily scavengers. They follow their nose to kills from wolves and grizzly bears and things like that, or sheep that didn't make it through the winter. So with wolves on the landscape there may be food for them. I think the question would be, is there enough snow for them to safely den into early spring or late spring, early summer? And that's really what they need to keep their young safe from other predators. And there are wolverines that are occupying the areas around Lake Superior in Ontario. That seems to be a place where they may actually be expanding their range, or maybe we're just looking a little closer now. So it's not too far away. I don't think it's totally out of the question. I think it would just come down to, is there enough snow? Are they going to be able to find denning opportunities there?
And have you been able to photograph mountain lions in Colorado?
I have, yes. I've had a few different attempts, and some were more successful than others. We had a mountain lion that spent a day in a tree not too far from here, and that allowed me a really rare daytime photo opportunity of a mountain lion. You don't get that very often. I've tried a few tactics to photograph them from a blind. It wasn't terribly successful. I did see one night, but I wasn't able to get any photos because it was so dark. The best footage that I've gotten in mountain lions comes from camera traps. That's been the most reliable way, just because they are so elusive and they're so in tune to their surroundings that your odds of seeing them are very, very low. But with a camera trap, being able to leave a camera out on a place where mountain lions are active for several months at a time sometimes, that's been a pretty successful way to photograph them.
And someone would like you to compare the relative sizes of prairie dogs, marmots, and pika and groundhogs.
Oh, okay. Relative size.
Yeah.
So pika's like a tennis ball, or maybe like the size of your fist. A prairie dog is maybe like a small loaf of bread. Not like sandwich bread. Think like banana bread or zucchini bread or a coffee cake or something like that. And marmots are on the bigger side. What would be a common item that a marmot would be? Like a large cat maybe, or a small dog. A little bigger than a football.
Okay.
Woodchuck is actually a marmot, so that's a good question too, because marmots are alpine woodchucks, basically. Different species. So out east we have woodchucks. Where I grew up in Michigan, we had woodchucks. That's Marmota monax, and then their cousins, Marmota flavoventris. That's the yellow-bellied marmot that lives here in Colorado. So they're basically just an alpine woodchuck, and sometimes people call them a rock chuck because of that.
And a little earlier, you mentioned a wolf population in Colorado, possibly. Are there currently wolves, and if so, how many and how are they doing?
It's believed that there are still wolves in Colorado. There are folks from from Colorado Parks and Wildlife that are monitoring that situation as best they can in the very remote northwest corner of Colorado. So it's believed that this pack of wolves made their way across the Wyoming border into Colorado and have been resident in that very extremely remote northwest corner of Colorado for about the last year. At this point, it's unknown how many wolves are there, from my sources anyway. There may be folks that are studying this that can that have more data, but maybe haven't disclosed it yet because it's very sensitive. But at this point, I think there are probably still at least 3 wolves left of that pack, and whether or not they've had pups this year, I don't know that, but there's been some speculation.
Interesting. And someone wants to know if you have any badger stories.
Oh, badgers. I love badgers. I really love all the mustelids. That's the weasel family. So that's badgers, that's weasels, that's otters, wolverines, martens. They're just like, they're probably my favorite family of animal because they have so much character. They're so bold. Everything they're looking at as a potential meal. So when they come up to you and they start checking you out, like, they're so curious, but they're just looking at you like, can I eat you? Definitely take you, but good thing I'm not hungry right now. Badgers. So I had to work a lot to find my first badger, and that was in the grasslands of Colorado. But out spotlighting for black-footed ferrets, you actually get to see them pretty regularly at night. Their eyes are very reflective, and they're often out at night. So we catch them in the headlights and the spotlights a lot while we're out spotlighting for the ferrets. And when you're out there on the prairie, you don't really have a good sense of distance and scale in the dark, and you just see a couple of eyes looking back at you. So you'll get the eyes in your headlight and you'll run out there, and about 50% of the time it's one of these crazy little spiders that's like super reflective. And I don't know how they do this, but their eyeballs reflect for like hundreds and hundreds of feet at night. But then, about a fifth of the time you stick your nose in there and it's either a ferret or a badger, and their eyes are very similar. And they're both mustelids. They both have kind of the same green color. And you stick your nose in there. So I've regularly stuck my nose into badger holes and been face to face with them out there in the prairie when we're doing this black-footed ferret research. And they have such a nasty reputation. Everybody's, oh, badgers are so mean if you ever back them into a corner. And I just haven't ever had that experience. Everyone that I've met has just kind of looked at me and given me this really gentle expression. And I think it's just, maybe you just have to give them some respect and understand that yeah, if somebody came to your house and shined a big light through your front door and backed you into a corner of your home, you might be kind of grouchy too. So yeah, just try to be very polite when I'm around a badger, and they seem to reciprocate.
It's good advice. So back to wolves. I've got a couple questions I'll combine. Are you actively searching for the wolf to photograph? And how do you feel the ballot referendum on wolf reintroduction will do? Do you see that the wind is blowing a particular way?
I am not actively searching for wolves right now. I have made it my mission to try to educate people about wolverines first and foremost. There's a lot of people fighting the wolf fight right now, and my hat goes off to them because it's a very, very complex conversation. But what I try to teach people is that a wolverine's not a wolf, even though the name starts with the first few letters being the same. They are a completely different animal, completely different set of conversations that we can have about wolverines. So right now, my focus has been on wolverines and not really dirtying that up with some of the preconceived notions or pre-drawn battle lines that seem to plague wolf conversations. As far as the ballot measure goes, I think this is going to be really interesting. But ultimately, I think what it comes down to is to have a successful wolf reintroduction in Colorado, it's going to take everybody. I think that wolves are an amazing animal, and it would be beautiful to see them on the landscape. At the same time, like it really takes the cooperation and the buy-in from the stakeholders that live in these communities, that ranch in these communities, that work in these communities that are directly affected by having wolves there. And if we get their support, and if we can find a way to work with wolves, to live with wolves, and then I think it'd be a really amazing thing to have them back here.
Are there any places outside of Colorado or even the US that you plan to visit and photograph, and any species in particular that you're most excited about?
Oh boy, all of them. I am like ADD about every species that comes along, but I've been really fortunate to be working on a film documentary series and making films in 360, which is like virtual reality. And unfortunately, this year things got a little sidetracked because of COVID and travel restrictions. But we traveled to Florida. We made a really cool film about manatees there, and there's so many more things that we have in the pipe for that, to try to share these wildlife experiences in a whole new format. So I'm hoping that in the coming years, or even hopefully as soon as next spring, as travel hopefully opens back up again, we'll be able to get to some of these places. So we're looking at doing things in Alaska, Costa Rica. We have a sloth shoot coming up, Australia, potentially Africa, and different things on rhinos. So I'm always excited about 3 or 4 things at once, but I think probably rhinos may be the next big crittering project, and there may be an opportunity there to photograph all 5 of the world's rhino species as another quest. We'll see.
Yeah, amazing. So what mammals are still on your list?
Let's see. We have the Wolverine, of course, the grizzly bear and the gray wolf. I photographed both of these species in places like the Yellowstone ecosystem. I have not photographed them in Colorado. So really my goal has been to photograph them in the wild in Colorado. And at this point, grizzly bear is pretty unlikely that there's any grizzly bears left in Colorado, but there are some historical places I'd like to go back and visit just to see what kind of habitat they were in the last time they were here, and just kind of digest that. The Fisher was on the list because the Fisher was known from one record near Aspen, but that was thought to have been released by a wildlife photographer, filmmaker of the 70s, who was a little bit of a notorious for keeping animals. It was a different era back then, but this one may have escaped from captivity and been found near Aspen. So I don't expect to find them here, but I am working on a project to potentially photograph Fishers in other parts of the range, like in the Pacific Northwest. Feral pigs and armadillos. The feral pig was an invasive species and was, at this point, is believed to be removed from Colorado. They've done a lot of damage, and they disrupt the ecosystem wherever they go. They cause a lot of agricultural damage. So our Parks and Wildlife has done a lot of work to try to get them out of here. So at this point, I don't think there are any feral pigs left in Colorado, but they were on the list. The armadillo seems to be expanding its range more and more into Colorado. They're more associated with the southern latitude states, not so much colder places, but that could be another climate shift species expansion as well. There's just been a handful of records of armadillos in Colorado, kind of in the southeast corner of the state. I've spent a fair bit of time down there. I haven't crossed paths with an armadillo yet, but that could still happen. I'm still working on the flying squirrel. I've gotten some photos, but I really want to get like that definitive photo of the squirrel coming in. It's got its flaps open, coming in for a landing, just that iconic flying squirrel shot. There's a least weasel, one of the 3 North American weasel species that's known to Colorado from only 1 record. And that one was probably misidentified. Not much hope of finding them here, but it's one of the few mammals, especially the carnivores of North America, that I haven't photographed. So I'm always on the lookout for those if I'm in Montana or something like that. And finally, I think the eastern spotted skunk was the only other one on the list. I'm still doing a little bit of work to look for those in Colorado. It's one of North America's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, I believe 5 skunk species. So there's an eastern spotted skunk and a western spotted skunk. And the western spotted skunk is relatively common in the pin and juniper canyon areas of Colorado. The eastern spotted skunk is actually losing a lot of range, and nobody has really determined why. It could be disease, it could be loss of habitat. They were in Colorado prior to the 1930s, and there haven't been any records of them here since then, but that was true for the hognose skunk as well, and we've managed to turn up a few of those now. So it's still possible that there could be some eastern spotted skunks in Colorado, but that one's kind of a long shot. We'll see.
Well, you're getting close.
Getting close.
So there are some people who want to know if your photos are on display anywhere in Colorado or if they can purchase prints from you.
Come to my website. It's on the slide here at the end, jamesbeissel.com. And if you're interested in print, definitely send me a message. I don't have anything currently on display. Displayed in the past at different galleries and things like that. But if I do, that information will go up on my blog or on my social media accounts, which you can all get to through my website. Thank you.
And final question, and also while I'm asking you this final question, if you could, someone wants to see that last quote by John Muir, if you could put that up again.
Absolutely.
So what NatHab trips do you guide?
I am still getting my feet wet, but the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is my stomping ground with NatHab.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that is the last question we will have time for today. So I'm going to turn back over to you for closing comments.
Well, thank you so much. I love to tell these stories, and I just love to encourage everyone to go out and explore, wherever it is that you live, and whatever list you want to make. It leads me to all these places that I never would have gone otherwise, and I think there's a beauty in that, and just getting to know a place by visiting it over and over again. So yeah, get out there and let's just protect these wild places that we have.
Thanks, Jim. This was a really great way to round out the week. So I appreciate you being here today, and your photography is beautiful and people really enjoyed your enthusiasm. So thank you so much. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And look out for our next lineup on Sunday in our e-news. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.